Hey, it's Mika. Sorry if my recording today is a little shit. I don't know if you guys can tell, but my voice is fucked. But I hope you enjoy it anyway. Deku, I think he's some pro. By clouds. My head in the clouds not coming down. Chapter 55. Training. Izuku woke up early to the smell of breakfast. Nezu was a surprisingly good cook, which Izuku hadn't expected, considering the only thing he'd seen him make before was tea. But then again, he supposed that no one cooked a lot in their work office, so that made sense. He got dressed quickly and went to the kitchen to see Nezu already setting the table. He smiled when he saw Izuku come in. "Good morning, Midoriya. I hope you slept adequately." Izuku nodded. The bed was really soft. Nezu laughed. "Yes, well, I have never quite understood humans' obsession with a firm mattress. I know that I live a more advanced life than most animals, but you must admit that there are times when humans miss the mark entirely, and your bedding is one of them. I believe Aizawa agrees, considering the way he cocoons himself." "He'd better be careful," Izuku grinned. "One of these days, he's gonna accidentally emerge as a beautiful butterfly." "More likely as a moth," Nezu countered. "I very much doubt that even his garish cocoon could impart any color to him." Izuku laughed. "Or maybe that sleeping bag has been gradually leaching away any color he once had." Nezu nodded sagely. "Its sins are too many to count. But don't just sit there. Eat." Izuku didn't have to be told twice, and dug in. "So, what's the plan for today?" "Well, I suppose that depends," Nezu said. "How are your computer skills?" "I've been trying to learn a little since you mentioned maybe teaching me hacking," Izuku shrugged. "But I don't think I'm very good yet." "Then that's where we'll begin." Nezu smiled encouragingly. "I'll give you some tasks to test your current ability. You're almost certainly further along than you believe. And then we'll advance into basic hacking." Hitoshi felt like he was going to die. Alright, so maybe that was a bit dramatic, but after how badly he'd embarrassed himself last night, he felt like he deserved to be depressed. He hadn't even been able to get through all of Aizawa's basic tests before he was too tired to continue. Which led him to where he currently was, trying to somehow force himself to do enough push-ups to impress a Razorhead. It wasn't going well. "Stop." Hitoshi didn't need to be told twice. He collapsed to the ground and splayed out on his belly. Maybe if he stayed there long enough, he might be able to feel his arms again. Aizawa looked at the notebook he was holding, then down at Hitoshi. "You're pushing yourself too hard. You can't expect to grow stronger overnight, Shinso. Bodies don't work that way." Hitoshi groaned and rolled over onto his back. "You're the one that said I had spaghetti arms." Aizawa gave a small smile. "Actually, I called you a stick figure, but I don't disagree with your assessment." Hitoshi groaned again, and Aizawa helped him to his feet. "But in all seriousness, if you try to overdo, you'll only end up hurting yourself. Deku did the same thing when we first started physical training, and he ended up learning moderation the hard way." Aizawa handed Hitoshi a water bottle that he gratefully accepted. "What happened?" "The problem child ended up passing out, and he's lucky he didn't pull a muscle." Aizawa shook his head. "Don't be like him." Hitoshi nodded. An injury would only set him back, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time if he wanted to prove he deserved his place in the hero course.
So I need to hold back. It's not so much holding back as knowing your limits, Aizawa said. Knowing how much you can handle is an important skill for any hero, but for underground heroes like us, it can mean the difference between life and death. You don't have a physical quirk, which means that there are some villains who are going to be a bad matchup for you. Over time, you'll develop the skills you need to beat them, but there are times in any hero's career where they have to choose to stay back and gather info instead of fighting. You're no use to anyone if you're dead or injured.
Hitoshi frowned.
I didn't think not fighting was an option.
Aizawa looked at him intensely.
Not fighting is always an option. It's your responsibility as a hero to get strong enough that it's not your only option. Take a break and get your breath back. We'll start again in a few minutes.
Hitoshi nodded and sat at one of the benches at the edge of the small gym. There was an area in the corner for weight training, and a sparring mat that Hitoshi was becoming a little too familiar with. But most of the room actually looked like a mini parkour course. Aizawa could navigate every single obstacle without breaking a sweat, but even the smallest ones still stopped Hitoshi in his tracks. He had a long way to go. "Shota, are you here?" Hitoshi startled as a woman's voice called from the hall, and he looked at Aizawa for guidance on how to handle the intruder. Eraserhead's agency was independent, so there wasn't supposed to be anyone else in the building, right? To his surprise, however, Aizawa just sighed and yelled back.
"I'm in the gym, Emmy."
He turned to glare at Hitoshi, his activated quirk making him even more intimidating than usual.
"If you tell anyone about her, I will expel you. Understood?"
Hitoshi nodded quickly, and Aizawa's hair fell around his shoulders right as the door slammed open, and a slim woman with sea-green hair strode into the room. She hadn't taken long to find them, so she must have already been comfortable with the layout of the agency, which meant that she'd been there before, probably multiple times. Hitoshi's eyes widened as the strange woman walked straight up to Aizawa, the same Aizawa who had the highest expulsion rate at UA and took down any villain he came across with brutal precision. That Aizawa. And gave him a kiss on the cheek. The woman must be insane. Hitoshi didn't know exactly what he'd been expecting, but it wasn't Aizawa sending her a glare without any power behind it, and her responding by sticking out her tongue. The woman looked around and saw Hitoshi, who froze when she grinned and turned back to Aizawa. "You got yourself another kid, Shota? You just can't help yourself, can you?" Aizawa sighed.
"Emmy, this is Shinso. He's interning with me this week. Shinso, this is Emmy Fukukata. Hero name, Miss Joke."
He dipped his head further into his capture weapon until he looked a little bit like a turtle.
"My girlfriend."
Oh. Mirio sat on the floor catching his breath as Gran Torino did the same across from him. They'd started sparring just after breakfast, but between the old-timer's jet and Mirio's permeation, neither of them had been able to land a single hit. It was like a massive game of tag where they were both it, but they were playing in a pinball machine. It was surprisingly fun. Gran Torino rolled a water bottle to him, which Mirio accepted gratefully.
"I gotta admit, kid, I wasn't expecting you to have mastered All for One already. Toshinori has a lot of strengths, but teaching isn't one of them. I'm pleasantly surprised he actually paid attention long enough to teach you how to use the quirk."
"Well, actually," Mirio grimaced. Gran Torino looked at him suspiciously.
What?
I mean, All Might's been great, Mirio said quickly. And I'm really lucky to be able to learn from him, but All for One actually broke my bones when I first got it. It wasn't until Sir got me a sit-down with Deku that I actually figured out how to use it without hurting myself.
Deku?
Gran Torino asked.
The analyst?
Mirio nodded. He's only a first year at UA, but he had an internship with Sir before school started, and he gave me some help after I demonstrated my quirk for him. To his surprise, Gran Torino chuckled.
So Deku really is a kid, huh? Well, I'll be.
Did you know that when he first came on the scene, the prevailing opinion was that he was some retired pro like yours truly? Sir mentioned something like that. Mirio smiled. Have you worked with him?
Nah, he said. But I got so many emails about the kid that I felt like I practically knew him. Since everyone thought he was an old geezer like me, they figured we must have crossed paths at some point.
What did you do? Mirio asked.
What do you think I did?
Gran Torino laughed.
I told them, of course I knew him. I started making up stories about all these shenanigans Deku and I had gotten back to in the good old days, but added just enough nonsense that no one could tell if I was actually being serious or not. When someone else would email me, I'd tell the same stories, but I'd change one or two major things so that when people talked, no one would be able to agree what actually happened, or if it happened at all. That was a fun time.
That's awesome! Mirio laughed. I bet you've gotten a lot of angry emails since people realized you were messing with them.
That's the best part, Gran Torino said. Everyone just assumes I'm a senile old man, so no one can get mad at me. Because I must have just misremembered. You can't use that trick yet, but trust me when I say it's the best part about getting old.
Katsuki tried not to explode as he ended up on his back again. So far, his internship with Midoko had consisted of a lot of sparring, which was a lot of fun, don't get him wrong, but it's just he was starting to get tired of losing. Every time he ended up on the ground, he had to fight against that gut feeling that he was worthless because he didn't win, and he was sick of it. The mutt's voice rang out in his ears, reminding him that Midoko was a top 10 pro and he was a first-year student, so obviously she was going to be a lot stronger than him. Reminding himself of that didn't make the feeling go away, though.
Let's take a break,
Midoko said, helping him up.
I can keep going,
Katsuki growled, before he could help himself. He needed to prove himself. Wait, no he didn't.
Ugh, this sucked.
Midoko chuckled.
Nah, your head's someplace else. That's no fun. You hungry?
Katsuki shrugged.
I could eat. That's what I want to hear.
Katsuki followed her into the kitchen, and she opened the fridge.
Here, have a carrot. I'm not a fucking rabbit.
Well, I am, so deal with it. She tossed him a carrot, which Katsuki snatched out of the air. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Katsuki broke the silence.
How did you get so strong?
Midoko thought for a moment. A lot of practice, mostly. My quirk doesn't hurt either, though growing up, I thought it made me weak. Her voice took on a high-pitched, mocking tone. Oh, it's the cute little bunny. Be careful not to spook her or she'll run away.
You got bullied?
Katsuki tried to bury his guilt as he remembered what he did to Deku. Midoko shrugged.
Kids can be mean. What are you gonna do? Joke's on them, though, because what they didn't know was that a cornered rabbit will do whatever it takes to survive. I'm not a coward. Never was. But I also had to learn what strength really was.
Katsuki froze.
What do you mean? Strength is strength, isn't it?
Midoko rolled her eyes. Any meathead can learn how to punch hard. You see all these thugs with strong quirks that think they're all that, but when push comes to shove, they're no different than someone quirkless. Because most of the time, it's about strength of will. Physical strength is going to do squat when you've been fighting for hours and feel like you're about to pass out. It's not going to help when lives are on the line, and you're against a villain that's a bad quirk matchup for you. Sometimes, strength is about fighting to save that one last person, especially when you feel like you can't.
But what about trying to be the best?
Katsuki asked.
You're high up in the rankings, so aren't you trying to be the best?
The best? Midoriya scowled. Fuck that. It doesn't matter if you're the strongest, Blasty. It matters that you're strong enough to fight when it matters. The best? She scoffed. If you're focused on being better than other heroes, that's kind of a dick move to the people you're supposed to be saving. A hero needs to be strong above all else, but it isn't a competition. It's a matter of life and death for both you and the people you need to save. Katsuki stared at her as he processed what she said. Strength wasn't about being the best. It never had been. He'd been wrong for all these years. Strength was about always being willing to fight for what mattered, and being able to keep fighting when it felt like he had no chance of winning. It was about being the strongest that he could possibly be, not about being stronger than Deku or Todoroki. If he was strong enough to fight when lives were on the line, then that was what mattered. And the only person he needed to compete with was himself. Katsuki stood and threw away the green part of his carrot.
Alright then, bunny bitch. I guess we better get back to work so I can really be strong when it matters.
Midoriya grinned. That's more like it. Now pretend I've got a hostage. Chapter 56. Learning. Izuku rubbed his eyes and wished he'd stolen some of Eraser's eye drops. He'd known that staring at a screen for so long could be exhausting, but before, he'd just been analyzing videos heroes sent, which felt as natural as breathing, so he'd hardly even noticed the strain. It wasn't that hacking was difficult per se. It was just that it was a brand new skill that he wasn't used to. He had to learn the grammar of different codes and make sure he didn't have any typos. Each line of code had to follow the last in a way that made sense to make sure the program did what he wanted it to in the correct order, whereas analyzing moved and made connections more freely. He was basically having to retrain his brain to think in a different way. It was still fun, though. Even when Nezu laughed that time he missed a semicolon and ended up yelling at the screen. It was a semicolon. It shouldn't have made that big of a difference, but no, it messed up the entire code and it had taken Izuku an entire hour to figure out what he was doing wrong. He hated computers. Okay, not really, but he was definitely glad that it was time to switch gears and do some work on paper instead of on screen. Hacking would probably be a lot easier once he'd had a chance to take a break and come back to it with a fresh mind. Nezu finished brewing the tea and brought it to the kitchen table as Izuku sat down. There were already a few files laid out between them, and Izuku opened one of them curiously. To his surprise, it seemed to be a practice test of some sort. I thought I'd already completed all of your intelligence tests, Izuku asked. Nezu chuckled. This is not a test I designed, Midoriya. Tsugaushi gave this to me a few days ago. I believe I told you that a private investigator's license would serve you well, didn't I not? Oh. Izuku looked at the test again, and sure enough, most of the questions were about legal restrictions and detective work. There's just been so much else going on. Nezu nodded. Yes, especially since you've decided to bring the number 2 hero to justice. However, that is exactly why you need a license. Much of the work you have been doing will apply towards the practical hours you need for it, and once you receive your license, the evidence you have gathered will be more easily admissible in court. Not to mention, the hacking skills you're learning this week will help you in this and in future investigations. Izuku nodded. That makes sense. So, do I just take this test, or... This, of course, is only a practice exam, Nezu said. But they are holding an exam shortly before the next semester begins, and I would like you to be prepared to take it. So, what do I need to know? Nezu grinned, and Izuku felt a chill run down his spine. Why don't you take the practice exam, and let's find out? Momo wasn't sure she'd made the correct choice for her internship. Uabami was a popular hero, and a strong woman, so Momo had assumed she'd learn a lot about being a woman in a field where men were much more common, and women were often objectified. She'd been hoping to learn how to avoid that objectification, and instead, she was left to wonder if her only option was to embrace it. There must be some other lesson that Uabami had in mind, but for the life of her, Momo couldn't find it. Kendo had apparently decided that Uabami was a joke, but Momo wasn't quite willing to admit that yet. The mentor couldn't be wasting their time, could she? Momo had always known that fame and public opinion was essential to being a hero. Her mom was a master of that, after all, but Uabami seemed to take that to the extreme. The only hero-like thing they'd done since they'd arrived was go on patrol. But even then, Uabami seemed to spend more time signing autographs than actually looking for villains and keeping people safe. Momo was still grateful, though. She honestly hadn't been expecting any offers at all, not after her epic failure against Tokuyami at the sports festival. She'd had such high expectations for herself and wanted so badly to make her parents proud, but instead she'd frozen when she should have fought. She just knew Mom was disappointed in her, even though she said she wasn't, but even more than that, Momo was disappointed in herself. How could she be a hero if she couldn't even fight when it really mattered? So she'd let Uabami drag her and Kendo into a commercial, which was interesting. It had taken much longer than Momo had thought it would, and afterward, Uabami stayed behind to sign autographs for the camera crew. Networking was what she'd called it, and Momo had gone with Kendo back to the dressing room. What do you think of all this, Yaoyorozu? Kendo asked. She was sitting on the counter and swinging her legs as they waited for Uabami to finally join them. We're lucky to have gotten the offer. Kendo rolled her eyes. I mean, yeah, but it's still ridiculous. Isn't she supposed to be teaching us something? Maybe we're missing it? Yaoyorozu replied. Leave it to her to be dumb enough to miss whatever that mentor was trying to teach them. You just keep telling yourself that, Kendo said. I don't know. Maybe what we need to take away from this is that the hero industry isn't as perfect as we grew up thinking. I mean, wouldn't Uabami have made a better model than a hero? Popularity is an important part of the industry, Momo said weakly. The argument sounded weaker every time she repeated it. You have homeroom with Eraserhead, Kendo pointed out. So while popularity is important, it's obviously not essential. I personally want to fight and save people, more than I want to have my own line of hair care products. Do you want to be a sexy hero? Yaoyorozu thought about it for a moment. Her mom was a sexy hero, but she still fought, unlike Uabami. But was that what Momo wanted? She remembered the way that Mineta had leered at her every time she'd entered the room, and her stomach turned. No, not really. I don't want people looking at me like that. Kendo shivered in solidarity. I know what you mean. Have you ever considered redesigning your hero costume? We could probably come up with a few ideas while we wait for Miss You Can Have Your Rabid Fanbase too to come back. Momo rubbed her arm awkwardly. Well, my costume needs to show a lot of skin. Kendo nodded. I get that. I can't have long sleeves on my costume for the same reason. They'd rip as soon as I activate my quirk, but now that you've been fighting for a while, you learned where you usually create items while fighting, right? Momo thought for a moment. I usually use my stomach or back for larger items, and my hands or wrists for smaller items, simply because they're more accessible if I make them there. I don't use my thighs nearly as much as I thought I would, though. I just don't think about them. Kendo looked around, then grabbed a napkin and an eyebrow pencil. Alright, so let's design based on how you actually use your quirk. You're pretty smart, Yayorozu. I couldn't remember all those chemical formulas if I tried, so I'm sure we'll be able to come up with something that will match the type of hero you want to be. Momo nodded and started sketching out some ideas. Kendo was most likely just humoring her, but, well, redesigning her costume was something productive to do while Umabami was busy signing autographs. Maybe Kendo was right, and Umabami didn't really care about anything besides popularity. Or maybe Momo was still just missing the lesson, but in the end, she supposed it didn't matter as much as she thought it did. If they couldn't learn anything from their mentor, they'd just have to learn from each other. To Atoshi's surprise, Miss Joke didn't leave after she realized Aizawa had an intern. Instead, she'd hung around and sat on the bench, laughing at him as he tried to survive Aizawa's nightmare training. He didn't know what he'd expected from whoever Aizawa was dating, considering that he was still trying to wrap his head around the idea of his favorite hero dating anyone, but if someone had told him that Eraserhead was dating an extrovert, he wouldn't have believed them. Hitoshi didn't necessarily mind her hanging around, it was just weird. It was also a little strange because Aizawa fought differently when she was around, almost like he was subconsciously trying to show off. If Hitoshi didn't live in mortal terror of Aizawa expelling him right after he'd gotten into the hero course, he would have been tempted to file that away for blackmail. It was a shame, but Hitoshi didn't have a death wish. At some point, Aizawa had gone to take a nap, and Hitoshi had taken the opportunity to collapse on the floor. He'd only been on this internship for 2 days, and he was already exhausted, but it would all be worth it the minute he held his real-life hero license in his hands. He just had to keep reminding himself of that. Are you okay? Hitoshi opened his eyes slightly to see Miss Joke standing above him, chuckling. Yeah. Hitoshi weakly pumped his fist into the air as he let his eyes closed. Living the dream. Miss Joke snorted. Oh my goodness. If Shota wasn't still alive, I think you were his little reincarnation. Hitoshi shook his head. No offense to your boyfriend or anything, but Aizawa is way scarier than I am. He didn't need to open his eyes to know that she was rolling hers. He's already given you his expulsion speech, hasn't he? If you mean he's made it crystal clear that he can kick me out of the hero course at any moment, then yes, Hitoshi said. He has given me the expulsion speech. Yeah, but that's Shota for you. Hitoshi glanced over as Miss Joke lay down on the mat next to him. But don't let him fool you. He's a giant softie. Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. I think your definition of softie might be a little skewed. Nope, she said with a pop. He took us to a cat cafe for our first date. That made Hitoshi sit up. What? She nodded. Like I said, softy. Hitoshi laid back down and shook his head in disbelief. I can't see that. Mr. Oak shrugged. He puts up a tough exterior, but don't let that fool you. The secret about Shoto is that he cares a little too much. And we both hate it when our students end up hurt because they didn't realize how dangerous it is to be a hero. But as long as you take things seriously, he'll do whatever it takes to make sure you succeed. Now up. Time to get back to work.
Fine.
Hitoshi groaned and stretched.
Whatever you say, Aizawa's girlfriend.
Mr. Oak laughed and helped him to his feet. You can just call me Joke, kid. She thought for a moment, and then a wicked grin spread across her face. Unless, of course, you want to see Shoto blush. In which case, just keep doing what you're doing. Hitoshi found himself with a matching grin. Well, if he had permission. Todoroki used his right side to bring down his body temperature again, as he lay down after another exhausting day of training. His control over his flames had gone up dramatically the past few days, but he was going to have to practice using each of his quirks just to regulate his temperature when he got back to UA, because Endeavor obviously wasn't focused on the balance between his two quirks. Maybe Midoriya would have some ideas? Todoroki jumped to his feet as the door to his room slammed open and his father walked in, the light from his mustache illuminating the dark room.
Shoto, be ready to leave early tomorrow.
Why? Shoto struggled to keep the suspicion out of his voice as much as possible. He didn't need to be dragged back into the training room again if he had to wake up early.
We're going to Hosu.
Endeavor turned and strode back out of the room.
It's time I show you what a real hero does.
Hey, it's Mika. If you enjoyed this podfic, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel or following me on Spotify for updates and new content weekly. Also, consider supporting me on Ko-Fi, link in the description. Anyways, I hope that you have a great day or night, and that your favorite author posts the exact fanfiction you visualized when you were meant to be doing work yesterday. Until next time.